India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is claiming victory in the world's largest election. He is set to serve a third term, but it appears his party will win fewer seats than expected, and Modi will have to deal with a much stronger opposition than he is used to. For more on the latest developments in the Indian elections, we're joined by Dr. Kshitij Bajpai. He is a senior research fellow for South Asia at Chatham House, an international affairs think tank, and we've reached him in London. And Kshitij, appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
So Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he's experienced this surprising setback in this election. What factors do you think contributed to his BJP not securing an outright majority, despite, the predictions of a landslide victory?
Well, I think it comes down to a economic and political story. So on the political front, I think the BJP and Modi always faced a bit of an uphill battle against the norms of Indian politics, which favor anti-incumbency and shaky coalition governments. I also think that the party's Hindutva or Hindu nationalist ideology didn't really resonate across the country, particularly among those with a more secular outlook, religious minorities, as well as parts of the country where there are strong regional identities, particularly in the south. And then on the economic front, I think the party's messaging on the economy of India being the world's fastest growing major economy, it really failed to resonate in the midst of high levels of high youth unemployment, inflationary pressures, and high levels of inequality. So I think it's a political and economic story which dented the Modi brand to some degree.
So with the BJP potentially needing to form a coalition to maintain power, what challenges and compromises do you foresee for Modi's leadership in this coming term?
Well, the BJP will, of course, still form the next government as the strongest party in the Lok Sabha, or the lower house of parliament, with its coalition surpassing the number of seats that's required to form a government. But a third-term Modi government will be more beholden to its coalition partners. I think the first key watch point will be to see the cabinet appointments. And if we see some reshuffles, we're likely to see some reshuffles given the need to appease coalition partners. Beyond that, coalition politics will have some implications or policy implications in terms of imposing constraints on the Modi government's more divisive, identity-driven politics, but also potentially slowing progress on some of its more politically sensitive economic reforms. And then over the longer term, I think Modi's weakened position will renew the debate about the party's succession plans. He's, I would argue, less likely to stand for a fourth term in 2029, which will then raise questions about who will lead the party in the next election.
What does this result mean for those who have serious concerns about the BJP and Modi moving towards authoritarianism?
I think that for the foreseeable future, that concern is somewhat less than it was previously. I mean, I think to some degree, this is obviously not great news for the BJP, but it's good news for India as it reaffirms its democratic credentials. I mean, it challenges these claims that a third-term Modi government would essentially mean the death of Indian democracy. So what we've seen in the last 24 hours is that on a procedural level, Indian democracy, remains very much intact. We can see that with today's results. We've also seen that with, recent state elections where there have been fewer recounts or complaints about vote rigging or manipulation. It shows that checks and balances persist, and it on the issue of India's this push towards demolishing the divide between state and religion. This attempt by the Modi government to reframe India as a Hindu Rashtra or a Hindu nation. I think that again will have been somewhat dented or undermined in the context of its weakened position following the election.
Kshitij, you talked about how Modi's tenure has been marked by both economic growth but also rising inequality. So how do you assess the impact of his economic policies on India's job market, the social fabric, especially concerning young people and marginalized communities?
So I think to the credit of the Modi government, they came to recognize that this earlier narrative of India, that India could somehow move straight from an agriculture to a service-based economy, was unsustainable, given the size of India's workforce. So they have invested a lot of time and effort into trying building up India's manufacturing potential. There's been a lot of investment in infrastructure. There's been an attempt to introduce several investor-friendly policies, production-linked incentives, Make in India, for instance. But that being said, I think it's the country still failed to live up to its full potential. We've seen a fall in FDI, foreign investment inflows. We've seen manufacturing as a share of GDP has essentially been stalled at around 17% or so. And the country still suffers from high levels of youth unemployment, high levels of inequality. I'm not just talking here about an urban-rural divide, but a divide between the more prosperous South and the more populous North, between those that are working in the formal sector and the much larger proportion of the workforce in the informal sector, and those are working in India's famed IT sector, which is a very small proportion of the overall workforce. So I think issues associated with unemployment, with inequality, I think are key in explaining why the Modi government has performed poorly in this election.
And Kshitij, just finally, before I let you go, how do you think this election result will impact the future of India-Canada relations, which have been, at quite a low point, especially in light of the recent allegations involving Indian agents and the attempted assassination of a Sikh activist, and how might Modi's continued leadership impact that relationship?
So I think the India-Canada relationship really needs to be seen through the broader context of India's foreign policy. So under the Modi government, we've seen a more assertive foreign policy as the government has tried to sort of reframe India as a civilizational state. Some of this has been rhetorical, referring to India as Bharat or India as a Vishwa Guru or teacher of the world or a Vishwa Mitra or a friend of the world. Some of it has been benign, India trying to play the role of a bridging power between the West and the global South, which we saw during its G20 presidency. However, what we've also seen is a more muscular foreign policy. We've seen a country that's more prone to taking offense to actions that challenge its sovereignty and status. And this is clearly what happened in the India-Canada relationship with these allegations of Indian complicity in the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, given his linkages to the Khalistan separatist movement. So I think the election outcome will mean that some of these more controversial elements to India's foreign policy, like the assertive behavior by India's intelligence services, are likely to be toned down as the government looks inward after its poor electoral performance and is more beholden to coalition partners.
Very interesting discussion with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Kshitij Bajpai is a senior research fellow for South Asia at Chatham House. We reached him in London.